I only bought shelter, but that drawer knew my grandfather's hands.
Toy da nanduok prompt kich ban ve Ellis Rowan va shuong ban le ruong tuyet tung. Da dan markdown, one ban muon toy bat dao viet part 1. Hai kiem tra chin sua prompt ne truok. Kau tra loai, dua tren kau truk va kak chi tiet trong prompt da tai len. Da dan markdown, 1 sua part 1. The Exile and Hook. He was 21 and broke. No room, no reference, no wages. Just a brass screw gauge and $3 he had kept folded behind his driver's license. And with that $3, he bought a forgotten cedar chest hinge workshop beyond Altavista in Campbell County, Virginia, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1987 when roof corner had dropped 6 inches. The chimney mortar sifted out like flour. The county condemned it on October 14, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But beneath the hinge-fitting bench waited a screw-gauge drawer unopened for 37 years, holding money, tools, and a ledger that would alter the shape of his future. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ellis Rowan had been listening his whole life, without knowing it. As a boy, he could tell which stair in the rental house would complain before his foot touched it. He knew when rain had entered the kitchen wall by the sourness beneath the paint, and he could hear his mother's old sedan laboring 2 blocks away. Silence, to Ellis, was never empty. It was a room full of small reports. His mother, Marlene, worked split shifts at a nursing home outside Lynchburg and slept with one hand curled around the alarm clock. She kept bills beneath the sugar bowl and never spoke of being tired. When Ellis brought home something broken, she said only, "See whether it can be made honest again." On Saturdays, his grandfather Amos Rowan collected him before sunrise in a blue Ford van that smelled of cedar dust and wintergreen liniment. Amos repaired cabinets, blanket chests, and old bureau drawers for families who could not afford replacements. He taught Ellis to pair a hinge mortise with the bevel-facing waist, to sort brass screws by gauge rather than by hopeful guessing, and to set a chest lid square before driving the final 2 screws. Their ritual never changed. Biscuits from a paper sack, coffee for Amos, milk for Ellis, then 3 quiet hours at the bench. Before noon, Amos would close each restored lid with 2 fingers and listen. A true lid settled with a low wooden sigh. A twisted one clicked at a corner. "Do not force a good thing to fit," Amos once told him. "Remove what is false, one shaving at a time." Ellis came to understand that the sentence applied to cedar, work, and men. Amos died in March 2018 after a stroke in the aisle of a farm supply store. By the time Ellis reached the rented garage where his grandfather had worked, the landlord had cleared it. The planes, chisels, screw tins, and bench hooks were gone. Ellis found only one curled cedar shaving beneath a radiator and kept it in a matchbox. 4 years later, he worked for Vale Moving and Storage, whose owner, Preston Vale, wore pale shirts buttoned hard at the throat. Vale never raised his voice. He stood close enough to smell of peppermints while asking questions whose answers he had already chosen. When the company began failing, brass bed bolts and cabinet pulls went missing from 2 jobs. Vale blamed the crew, withheld their final wages, and wrote Ellis's name beside the losses in a black ledger. The warehouse closed on November 3rd, 2022. Ellis rented a narrow room above it, and Vale owned that too. At dusk, Ellis found his mattress folded against the hallway wall, his matchbox balanced on top. Marlene stood at the foot of the stairs, with her purse held in both hands. Vale placed the room key on the window ledge. "You leave tonight. Your mother signed the statement. 8 words. Ellis looked at Marlene. She studied a loose thread on her cuff and did not lift her face. He put the matchbox in his pocket, took the brass gauge from his tool roll, and left the mattress where it leaned. For 6 weeks, he moved south and east through Lynchburg, Madison Heights, and Rustburg, carrying one canvas bag. The first nights he slept beneath the awning of a closed tire shop, then in a church utility shed whose door did not latch, then inside an abandoned feed trailer behind a rail spur. He began with $47.12. Bus fare took $11. Bread, peanut butter, and 2 laundromat washes took 9 more. By Thanksgiving, he had $16. By the second week of December, after a fever and 3 nights in the Lynchburg bus station, he had 6. He stopped buying coffee. He learned which library opened earliest, which gas station clerk allowed him to fill a bottle, and how cold concrete climbed through cardboard before midnight. On December 16th, he entered the Campbell County Public Library to warm his hands over a restroom vent. A classified sheet lay beside the copier, its corners softened by use. Near the bottom, under county disposals, one notice had been circled in blue pencil. Cedar Hinge Shop, Structure and Lot. Tax title clearance, $3. Buyer assumes all conditions. Applications closed at 4. Ellis read it twice. The words Cedar and Hinge stood together with the plain authority of a door opening. He checked the wall clock, copied the address onto the back of a discarded receipt, and counted the money in his pocket. 3 $1 bills, nothing else. At 1:20 that afternoon, he boarded the county bus toward Altavista with the screw gauge in his coat and his grandfather's cedar shaving tucked close to his heart. By nightfall, the $3 workshop would have an owner. Cow, Tetra, LOI, 3 Sua. Part 2. The Arrival. The bus carried Ellis south, beneath a tin-colored sky, stopping at crossroads where no one boarded. He rode 28 miles before the driver set him down outside Altavista with a transfer already expired. County directions sent him 6 miles along Bedford Avenue, then east where pavement narrowed into winter fields. Darkness caught him beside a hay barn with one door hanging open. The temperature fell to 27 degrees. Ellis climbed into the loft, buried his legs beneath loose timothy, and slept in intervals while mice worked below. At dawn, frost silvered the rafters. He shook hay from his coat and walked the remaining 4 miles with one hand around the matchbox in his pocket. Altavista was waking when he reached Main Street. A truck idled beside English's pharmacy. Steam clouded the Main Street Cafe. A broom moved behind the glass at Dalton Hardware. The clock at First National Bank showed 8:12, and Altavista Motors had 3 used pickups beneath faded pennants. Ellis passed them all. Every dollar he owned had already been promised. The county clerk's annex occupied a square brick building beside the old courthouse. Inside, fluorescent light rested on green tile and metal cabinets. A woman with a silver pencil pushed through her hair sat behind the counter. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Lucille Ward. She looked at his canvas bag, then at the notice. You understand the roof has failed at the northwest corner? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no active electrical service? Yes, ma'am. You understand the well has not been tested since 1989? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition costs become yours if the structure is unsafe? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Ward held his gaze as though waiting for youth to reveal itself as carelessness. Ellis laid the 3 bills on the counter. One had been repaired with clear tape. She smoothed them beneath her palm, drew out a deed packet, and turned it toward him. He signed in 6 places. The clerk pressed a brass county stamp into a red pad and brought it down with the sound of a small door closing. She gave him the yellow copy, then wrote directions in block letters. Cross the Staunton River Bridge. Right on River Road. Pass the old pump house. Gravel lane after the second white oak. When Ellis tucked the deed into his coat, Mrs. Ward noticed his signature. Rowan. Any relation to Amos Rowan? He was my grandfather. She removed her glasses. A pale mark crossed her nose. He repaired my mother's cedar chest after the flood of '85. The lid had swollen crooked, and every hinge screw was stripped. He worked at our kitchen table most of a Sunday. Ellis touched the brass gauge through his coat. She tried to pay him. He asked for 2 jars of beans. Mrs. Ward rested her hand on the deed. There was a small cedar shop out that way. I saw his van on that road more than once. Outside, Ellis crossed the Staunton River Bridge, while trucks lifted grit against his trousers. River Road followed dark water past bare pasture and a white farmhouse. An old man in red suspenders split kindling beside the porch. A black and tan hound came to the fence and gave one grave bark. "You headed to Bell's place?" the man called. Ellis raised the deed. Mind the walnut limbs. They come down quiet. Beyond the second white oak, the gravel lane was almost lost beneath leaves. 4 walnut trees leaned over it, their branches knuckled against the sky. Ellis followed the track past a collapsed tobacco shed until the workshop appeared. It was a 1-story frame building, roughly 24 by 36 feet, sheathed in weathered chestnut boards over a fieldstone foundation. The standing seam tin roof had rusted red and sagged at the northwest corner. A narrow brick chimney rose from the rear wall without a cap. Above the double doors, a cedar sign showed 3 surviving words: Bell Hinge Works. Ellis walked the perimeter. One gutter lay in the weeds. A window had been patched with a flour sack. At the rear, cedar shavings clung beneath the sill, darkened nearly black but fragrant when he rubbed one between his fingers. The scent brought Amos's van back so plainly that Ellis looked toward the lane. No one was there. The front doors resisted until he lifted the right leaf by its iron strap. It opened with a dry scrape, releasing air that smelled of cedar oil, cold ash, mouse nests, and old brass. Dust moved in the sunlight. Beneath his boots, the floor gave one low complaint and held. The front room contained a cast-iron stove, a scarred table, and shelves lined with hinge leaves wrapped in brittle paper. The paper whispered against his thumb. Somewhere inside the wall, a mouse scratched twice and stopped. He tasted rust in the air and cedar at the back of his tongue. The rear room was the workshop. A footspress stood near the chimney, its pedal frozen at the joint. Cedar boards rested overhead on ceiling racks, each one flat and dry. Along the east wall ran a hinge-fitting bench with a narrow vise and rows of shallow drawers. Brass screws gleamed in several open compartments. Ellis turned one between his fingers. Number 8, 1 inch, slotted oval head. The threads were sharp. By late afternoon, he found a dented bucket, carried water from the river, and wiped a square of floor beside the stove. There was no dry fuel, so he did not risk a fire. He ate the last heel of bread and folded his coat beneath his head. Cold entered through the boards after dark. The building shifted as wind crossed the roof, each timber making its own measured sound. Ellis listened until he could distinguish the loose window from the settling joist, the walnut branch from the stovepipe, and the small, exact click of metal cooling beneath the bench. A true lid settled with a low wooden sigh. Cautra, LOI, 4 Suap, Part 3, The Discovery. For 3 days, Ellis learned the property by need. The well stood 40 yards behind the workshop beneath a split cedar cover. He drew the first bucket slowly, let the iron-tasting water settle, then boiled it before drinking. The outhouse leaned toward the creek, but held after he replaced one hinge pin with a cut nail. Indoors, he mapped the floor by sound. A hollow creak before the stove, a chirp beside the east wall, and one broad plank near the fitting bench that stayed silent under his full weight. On the fourth morning, he walked to town with the yellow deed inside his shirt. Dalton Hardware was narrow and warm, with stove heat, kerosene, rope, and oiled steel. Its owner, Hugh Dalton, had one white eyebrow and one brown, which lifted separately when Ellis set down the deed. So Lucille let somebody have Bell's place. She sold it for $3. Selling is generous. Ellis asked the price of a chimney brush. Hugh watched him count the coins he did not have, then opened a ruled account book. I can carry you 30 days. I cannot promise 30, then promise honest. Ellis signed. Hugh added a green booklet titled Repairs for the Rural Home. That one's free. The pictures are better than the advice. Ellis bought a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $4.85, 50 feet of sash cord for $2.10, a pound of 8-penny cut nails for $1.35, stove cement for $1.90, and a second-hand handsaw for $3.25. Hugh wrote each amount beside his name without adding interest. The chimney took most of that day and half the next. Ellis tied the brush to sash cord, climbed the rear roof by a borrowed ladder, and lowered the bristles through the uncapped flue. The first pull stopped hard. He worked in short strokes, turning the brush a quarter circle until black crust broke loose and fell inside the stove like gravel. Creosote came down in brittle scales and greasy soot that stained his wrists through both sleeves. At the stove, he removed the pipe elbow, scraped the bend with a flattened spoon, and pressed stove cement into 2 hairline gaps. He spent 6 hours the first day and 3 the next, stopping when the brush rose without catching, and daylight showed as a clean gray circle above. For the test fire, he split dead walnut no thicker than his finger and laid it over cedar shavings. He opened the damper, warmed the flue with burning paper, then touched flame to the kindling. Smoke hesitated beneath the lid, found the draft, and lifted. The pipe began to tick. Heat reached his knees first. He boiled well water, stirred cornmeal with a brass hinge leaf, and ate from the coffee tin with salt Hugh had folded into paper. It was his first hot meal in 9 days. He held the tin between both palms until his fingers softened. That afternoon, he inventoried the workroom. A cast steel hinge swage stood beside a rosewood marking gauge worn pale by a thumb. Boxes held number 6, 8, and 10 brass screws. A square punch remained centered in the foot press. Nearby lay a cedar lid pattern, a hand brace fitted with a countersink bit, and a tray of waxed linen thread once used to bind hardware sets. The bench was nearly 12 feet long, its edge polished by sleeves. Beneath it ran 9 drawers, each marked with a brass screw gauge disc. 6 opened easily. The number 8 drawer moved half an inch and stopped. Ellis did not force it. He emptied the drawers above and below, then tapped the bench face with the marking gauge. Most of the wood answered with a dry note. Behind the number 8 disc, the sound dropped lower. The drawer was too heavy for screws, yet its runners did not sag. The disc's screw turned only after he warmed it over the stove and touched the threads with lamp oil. Beneath it lay a cedar plug no wider than a quarter, fitted so its grain continued the drawer front. Using the countersink point, Ellis turned the disc 1/8 of a rotation. Something released. The drawer slid forward, revealing a false back 4 inches behind where the compartment should have ended. He set it on the bench. The false panel was weighted at the bottom and held by 2 brass spring clips. Pressing both at once required the span of his hands. When they gave, the panel leaned toward him. Behind it were 3 packages wrapped in waxed muslin, 1 narrow parcel tied with linen cord, and a square tin box darkened nearly black. Ellis carried everything to the stove table and shut the doors against the wind. The narrow parcel held Amos Rowan's dovetail saw, recognizable by a crescent burn on the beech handle. Beside it lay a mortising chisel, a brass-backed screwdriver, and the rosewood square Amos had used to test chest corners. Each tool had been oiled before wrapping. None showed rust. Ellis sat down without touching the next package. The second bundle held raw brass hinge leaves and 6 cedar test blocks marked with screw gauges and lid weights. The third held a gray delivery ledger. Its pages listed names, mill addresses, chest types, and careful notes. Lid reset, no charge. Hinges matched. Family laid off. Cedar split repaired before wetting. He placed the ledger aside. The tin opened on a resistant hinge. Currency was bundled by decade, with coin rolls tucked into the corners. Ellis moved each group separately, counting aloud, then counting again. There were Morgan dollars, Barber half-dollars, wheat cents, and Liberty Head nickels. One envelope held a tarnished Purple Heart, engraved E. Bell, 1944. Beneath it rested banknotes in 20s, 10s, 5s, and 1s, many carrying seals he had never seen. He counted until midnight. The total was $29,760. Ellis wrote the figure on the county directions, checked every bundle once more, and returned the money to the tin. He did not spend a bill. He did not open the letter sealed beneath the ledger. He carried the tin and tools back into the false compartment, leaving only the ledger and letter on the table. Then he stepped outside. The Staunton River moved beyond the walnuts, dark except where moonlight broke along the current. Ellis stood at the bank with his coat open, listening to water pass stones he could not see. Behind him, the workshop held its fire and kept its silence. A true lid settled with a low wooden sigh. Cow tra loi Sue. Part 4, The Letter. At first light, Ellis set the kettle on the stove and brought the sealed envelope to the window. The writing slanted forward in narrow blue strokes, each capital cut with the same hard downstroke Amos had used on repair tags. Ellis ran his thumb beneath the name on the front. It said only, "To the one who opens the gauge drawer." He broke the seal with the tip of the mortising chisel. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the number 8 drawer still opens by patience rather than force. That is a comfort to me. My name is Margaret Anne Bell. Dr. Samuel Harkness at Virginia Baptist Hospital in Lynchburg has told me the cancer has reached my liver. He speaks gently and does not offer false measurements. I have perhaps 4 months, though I have lived long enough to know that wood, weather, and bodies do not consult calendars. The shop began with my great-grandfather, Josiah Bell, born in 1841 near Appomattox Courthouse. He fitted wagon boxes before making cedar chests in Altavista after the railroad came. His son, Thomas Bell, born in 1872, moved the work beside the Staunton River in 1896. Thomas's daughter Ruth, born here in 1878, learned the hinge bench when customers still believed only sons could inherit tools. Ruth was my mother. I was born in 1909 and took the trade from her hands in 1931. 4 generations, 4 benches, and no secret more valuable than exact work. My husband, Edward Bell, was killed in France in 1944 while serving with the 29th Infantry Division. The Purple Heart in the tin came home without him. After the war, my son Daniel and I kept this place open. When the textile mills laid men off, young couples brought us hope chests with sprung lids and stripped screws. We repaired them without charge when we could. The gray ledger records those names because kindness deserves the same careful accounting as debt. Daniel died before me. I closed the trade on September 30th, 1985. Since that afternoon, the foot press has not moved, and this room has known more than 37 years of silence. A few instructions may still be of use. Warm old hide glue to 140 degrees, never boiling. For a loose hinge screw, mix 2 parts cedar dust with 1 part glue, and let the repair stand overnight before boring again. Cut a mortise no deeper than the hinge leaf, then pare the corners by hand. When setting a lid, drive the outer screws first, wait 10 minutes, and test the close before placing the center pair. Cedar bruises easily. A careless thumb can mark what a century of weather did not. The money was saved from repairs, timber sales, and Daniel's wages. It was never meant for display. Use what the work requires. Leave what you can for the person who comes after you. Inheritance is not ownership. It is the duty to sharpen what is dulled, replace what has failed, and teach the next pair of hands why the grain runs as it does. A tool kept only as a relic has been buried above ground. Behind the workshop, follow the path to the river until you reach the flat fieldstone marked with a 4-leaf hinge. Edward set it there before the war. Stand on it at dusk, and you will see why we never moved the bench from this valley. There is an old brass lamp in the cabinet beneath the ledger shelf. Clean the wick, fill it sparingly, and light it once for those who worked here without having their names painted on the sign. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Margaret Anne Bell, January 12, 1986. Ellis read the letter twice. The second time, he heard the sentences in Amos's measured cadence. Not because the voices were alike, but because both left room around an instruction. He folded the pages along their original creases, pressing each edge flat with the side of his hand. Behind the workshop, a path descended through wet grass and walnut roots. Ellis followed it to the river, counting 37 steps from the back door. At the waterline, winter mud covered a flat stone. He scraped it clean with his boot. A 4-leaf hinge had been cut into the fieldstone, its leaves meeting around a square pin. From there, he could see the river bend, the old pump house, and the workshop chimney standing above the trees. The bench faced the long evening light. Back inside, Ellis found the brass lamp beneath the ledger shelf. Its chimney was clouded and its wick had hardened to a black curl. He washed the glass with warm water, trimmed the wick square, and poured in a finger's depth of kerosene from the stove can. The flame rose small and amber, brightening the worn place where generations of hands had reached for the drawer pulls. He thought of Mrs. Ward smoothing his taped dollar bills before stamping the deed. Hugh Dalton had opened an account for a man with no address. The old neighbor in red suspenders had warned him about falling walnut limbs instead of asking what right he had to be there. Even the county bus driver had waited while Ellis gathered his bag, though the road behind them had been empty. None of them had changed his life by themselves. Each had simply refused to make a hard hour harder. Before the story moves on, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to help. Perhaps it was a meal, a ride, a patient answer, or a door left open. Tell us about that person in the comments, and let their name be remembered for a moment. That night, Ellis wrapped Amos's saw and Margaret's letter in clean muslin. He placed them beside his blanket, with the rosewood square between them. The brass lamp burned until the room had warmed, then he lowered the wick and slept in the cedar dark. Kautra Loi, 6 Sua, Part 5. The Slow Rebuild. On December 3rd, 4 inches of snow settled over the sagging roof and showed Ellis exactly where he'd escaped. The white surface melted first above the stovepipe, then along a crooked line where the northwest rafters had pulled apart. He read the roofing chapter in Hugh Dalton's green manual 3 times, once by daylight and twice beside the brass lamp. The roof measured 26 by 38 feet along the slopes. Allowing 10% for cuts and breakage, he calculated 11 squares of shingles, 4 rolls of felt, and 30 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. The materials cost more than he could carry on credit, so Hugh found weathered tin of the same seam pattern behind an abandoned dairy shed and charged only for hauling. When Ellis came for nails, Hugh placed a roofing hatchet on the counter. Its leather grip was black with old sweat. "My brother's," he said. "He won't need it now." Ellis accepted it with both hands. Orrin Maddox, a retired roofer of 72, arrived the next morning in wool trousers and a canvas coat, polished at the elbows. His left thumb ended at the first joint. He examined the broken corner, spat into the snow, and refused payment before Ellis had offered it. They worked 11 days. Orrin showed him how to sister a sound rafter beside the split one, clamping the pair before driving bolts through both. They snapped a chalk line from eave to ridge and laid each salvaged sheet so water could not find an uphill seam. Orrin drove nails in 3 strokes: set, seat, finish. That nail's proud. Ellis raised the hatchet. Pull it. By December 15th, the final seam lay folded tight beneath a cold blue sky. Ellis climbed down and stood in the lane while snowmelt ran from the repaired corner in one clean line. January found the chimney shedding itself from within. Several bricks had spalled into shallow red bowls, and the mortar powdered beneath a fingertip. Ellis removed only what had failed, numbering the sound bricks in pencil before lifting them free. Hugh sold him hydraulic lime and fire clay on further credit. Ellis mixed them 3 parts lime to 1 part fire clay, adding water until the mortar held a ridge without slumping. He dampened every joint first so the old brick would not draw the new mix dry. For 3 weeks, the temperature stayed in the 20s. Ellis worked barehanded because gloves dulled the pressure needed to pack narrow joints. Every 15 minutes, his fingers went numb. He warmed them against the stove, then returned before feeling had fully come back. He rebuilt the smoke shelf, reset the loose flue tile, and tooled each joint with the rounded back of a spoon. On January 28th, he lit a test fire of cedar splints and 1 dry walnut billet. Smoke rose through the throat, gathered speed, and drew clean above the roof without leaking into the room. Ellis watched the flame for an hour before adding another stick. The floors waited beneath 80 years of wax, soot, and boot marks. They were white pine, wide and soft, held by hand-cut rose-head nails, whose dark heads sat just below the grain. Ellis drove each loose nail home with a narrow punch before renting a random orbit sander from Hugh for $14 a day. The first pass, at 80 grit, stripped away the blackened surface and exposed pale wood. 120 grit removed the coarse tracks. 220 left the board smooth without erasing the shallow hollows made by generations of feet. He vacuumed the room with a borrowed shop machine, then wiped the boards with clean cotton until no dust rose. 3 thin coats of oil followed. Each worked along the grain and rubbed free of excess. After the final coat, he closed the doors and allowed a full 48-hour cure. The color deepened from dark honey toward mahogany, though the wood was still pine. Light from the windows settled into it rather than lying on top. One morning, Ellis woke with the sander beside him and could not lift it. He carried no tools that day. He walked to the marsh below the river bend and sat on a wet cedar stump. A great blue heron stood among the reeds, motionless until noon, then opened its wings and crossed the water. Ellis remained after it had gone. The next morning, he returned to work. 8 windows looked out from the shop. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 held an original pane dated by its wavering bubbles and the narrow muntin around it. Someone had scratched 1788 into the lower corner of the sash. Ellis preserved that pane exactly as it was. He removed the loose glazing with a putty knife warmed near the stove. After bedding replacement glass in a thin ribbon of DAP 33, he pressed glazing points into the muntins and rolled fresh putty between his palms. He laid each bevel with one deliberate pull, keeping the inner edge just below the sight line so no putty would show from inside. The sash cords had rotted to brown fibers. Ellis replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley, and tying a figure-8 knot at the counterweight. The first knot slipped. The second held. By the fourth window, he could feel the proper tension before lowering the sash. He repaired the missing panes with old glass Hugh had saved from a schoolhouse renovation. Each sheet bore a faint distortion that made the walnut trunks outside seem to breathe when wind moved their branches. On the last window, Ellis set the upper sash into its channel and tested the balance. It rose without binding and remained where he left it. A chickadee landed on a walnut branch beyond the glass, its black cap tilted toward him. Ellis held still, with one hand resting on the sash cord, until the bird flew toward the river. Kautra, LOI, 7 Sua. Part 5, The Slow Rebuild. By late February, the walls had begun shedding their oldest repairs. Horsehair plaster clung to hand-split oak lath, but 3 patches beside the chimney failed in as many mornings. The first cracked at the edge. The second sagged before supper. The third fell overnight and broke across the newly oiled floor. Ellis swept it up without speaking. Hugh brought an old feed bag half filled with horsehair, saved from his father's plastering days. Ellis mixed it into lime plaster until the fibers crossed the mortar like fine roots. He dampened the lath, pressed on a scored scratch coat, and waited until it held beneath his thumb. The brown coat went on 3/8 of an inch thick and cured for 72 hours. A final 1/8 inch coat closed the surface beneath a steel trowel. The repaired wall remained slightly uneven in afternoon light. Ellis left it that way. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Bellamy owned the Main Street Cafe and wore her gray hair twisted around a yellow pencil. Twice a week, she left a paper bag on the workshop step before sunrise. Inside might be biscuits, an apple, or a jar of soup wrapped in newspaper. When Ellis carried money to the cafe, she pushed his hand back across the counter. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Caleb Wynne arrived one Saturday on a red Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail, with one front tooth chipped at the corner. Without introduction, he split the walnut rounds behind the shed and stacked them, bark side up. Ellis offered him $2. Caleb shook his head. "My mother said, 'About your grandfather.'" He would not explain further. He rode away with the maul over one shoulder and returned the following week. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk to the river. His black hat was brushed nearly gray along the crown, and he always tipped it at the lane. One wet Tuesday, he stepped inside, helped Ellis lift a sheet of lath, then bowed his head beside the cold stove. "Keep these hands steady, Lord." He left before the kettle boiled. Ellis postponed the cellar until February 11th. The hatch beneath the rear shelves had swollen shut, and when it opened, cold earth breathed through the floor. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot room paved in fieldstone. At the center lay a dressed granite slab bearing the same 4-leaf hinge mark carved beside the river. Its edges were too exact for a foundation stone. Ellis brushed dirt from the symbol, tested one corner with his fingertips, and did not lift it. Under the 3rd step, an oak box had been wedged between stone and joist. Inside lay a brass key whose bow was shaped like a small, open hinge. Beneath it rested a tin type dated 1903. The photograph showed a young woman outside the workshop, holding a mortising chisel against her apron. She had Ellis's narrow jaw, his deep-set eyes, and the same uneven left eyebrow. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Ruth Bell, daughter of Thomas Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Ellis carried the photograph upstairs and placed it beside Margaret's letter. The brass key remained on the mantel. No lock in the workshop accepted it. March loosened the snow from the north wall. The creek grew loud with runoff, and pale green catkins hung from the walnut trees. By April, the lane had softened into mud, and violets appeared between the foundation stones. Ellis decided not to begin a full cedar chest that spring. He spent one worn wheat cent from the cash on scrap cedar, recording the coin and its date in the gray ledger. He cut practice mortises, matched screw gauges, and fitted small lids no larger than a book. Some closed crooked, some bruised at the corners. He saved every one. The house was patient. So was he. Part 6. The Epilogue. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ellis completed the first full cedar chest made in the workshop since Margaret Bell had closed it. The chest was 36 inches wide, built from Virginia red cedar boards he had air-dried beneath the ceiling racks. He planed the lid by hand, cut each hinge pocket to the exact thickness of the brass leaf, and drove number 8 screws into holes repaired with cedar dust and warm hide glue. Before fitting the center pair, he waited 10 minutes. Then he lowered the lid with 2 fingers. No corner clicked. The cedar settled evenly against the rim, releasing a low breath of resin and enclosed air. Ellis opened it and tested it again. The restored interior around him was modest and exact. The foot press moved cleanly at the joint. Tools hung above the bench in their working order, not as decoration. The old pane marked 1788 remained in the eastern window, bending winter light across the floor. Margaret's lamp stood filled but unlit beside the ledger. The brass key kept waiting on the mantel. In January, while trimming a dead limb from the oldest walnut tree, Ellis noticed a green edge beneath the bark. A narrow brass plate had been set into the trunk long ago and nearly swallowed by growth. At its center was a keyhole, shaped like the pin of a hinge. The cellar key turned once. Behind the plate was a cavity lined with tin. Ellis reached inside and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. It contained a folded 48-star American flag, protected from damp by waxed paper, and a note in Ruth Bell's handwriting, dated November 18, 1918. She had written it 1 week after the armistice ending the First World War. Her younger brother, Samuel Bell, had died of influenza at Camp Lee before his regiment sailed. The family had received no battlefield medal, only the flag that had covered his coffin during the burial service. Ruth hid it in the walnut because her father could not bear to see it indoors and could not allow it to be discarded. Her note asked that the flag remain folded until someone understood that grief could be kept without being displayed. Ellis refolded the oilcloth around the note and carried the flag into the workshop. He built a cedar case with no glass front, fitted its lid with 2 hand-cut hinges, and placed the bundle inside. The case went beneath the ledger shelf, within reach but out of sight. The Purple Heart from 1944 belonged to Edward Bell. On June 6, 2025, the 81st anniversary of the Normandy landings, Ellis carried it to Fort Hill Memorial Park in Lynchburg. He set it beside Edward's marker before sunrise, remained through the first light, then returned it to the workshop ledger drawer with the cemetery date written beneath his name. Of the money hidden in the tin, Ellis used only 4 coins. 1 wheat cent paid symbolic for this first practice cedar. A barber $50 bought a packet of number 8 brass screws from an estate box Hugh had refused to price. 1 Liberty Head nickel went beneath the threshold when the front sill was replaced. The 4th, a Morgan dollar, paid Doris for the first candle placed in the reopened shop, though she protested until Ellis closed her fingers around it. The remaining money stayed wrapped and counted. He sealed it inside a new cedar compartment behind the screw gauge drawer, along with a copy of Margaret's letter, his repair accounts, and a note marked for the next one. The shop reopened without a ceremony. Doris pinned a white index card to the cafe corkboard. Cedar chests repaired. Hinges matched. Lids set true. Ask for Ellis at Bell. Hinge works. The first customer brought a wedding chest with one bent hinge. The second mailed a photograph from Roanoke. By autumn, more than 40 names filled a mailing list kept in a school composition book. Ellis accepted only the work he could finish carefully. Families who had lost jobs found no charge written beside their names. Caleb returned in October carrying a cedar sign wrapped in a wool blanket. He had grown taller and had stopped arriving by bicycle. The sign reproduced the old lettering above the doors. Bell Hinge Works. Beneath it, in smaller hand-carved letters, he had added, "and daughters." Ellis traced the new words. "There are no daughters here," he said. Caleb shrugged and looked toward Ruth's tintype on the shelf. There were. There will be. They hung the sign together before the first frost. Ellis left the old board beneath it, its surviving letters still visible through the weathering. Nothing was erased to make room. That winter, he began his own letter. He used Margaret's desk, Amos's square, and a sheet of cream paper from Mrs. Ward's office. The first line came without revision. "My dear one, whoever you are," he wrote that the well pump required priming and hard freezes, that the northwest roof seam should be inspected each September, and that old cedar must be supported beneath the cut. He recorded Hugh's account, Doris's paper bags, Caleb's firewood, and Reverend Boyd's four-word prayer. He named the 4 coins he had spent and explained where the rest remained. He did not write that the building had saved him, that would have placed all the work on timber and stone. He wrote instead that a place could wait while a person learned to become careful enough for it. At dusk, Ellis tested the completed chest once more. Outside, walnut limbs moved above the repaired roof. The river passed the marked fieldstone, carrying winter light downstream. Inside, the brass lamp made a small amber circle over the ledger and the beginning of his letter. A true lid settled with a low wooden sigh. He closed the drawer, but did not lock it. Years earlier, one of Ellis's 3 taped dollar bills had caught beneath the brass stamp in Mrs. Ward's office. She found it after he left and kept it in the bottom desk drawer, rather than entering it with the county receipts. The tape yellowed. The fold remained. When she retired, she left the bill there with a note for the next clerk. "This bought the Bell place. Do not spend it." Beyond Altavista, evening gathered around the walnut trees. A careful light remained in the eastern window, and cedar waited beneath the plane. The Cedar Chest Hinge workshop waits. It has always waited. Script complete. Total approximately 39,800 characters.